windows, way up high, stood wide open, allowing Indian summer to bewilder the kids inside. Jim Brandecker looked up from the crisscrossing blue lines on the blank leaf of his physics lab book. First quarter days were too hard to bear, even without the extra torment of a pretend summer. How could Jim write a composition on the 3 states of matter? Jim had a poem on his mind, Dear Chris. Jim had written to get on target. He wanted to write one of those sonnets. Wounds of the heart leave wisdom when they heal. How come Jim couldn't imagine nothing more than that one line? He glanced at Mr. O'Donnelly. For once his physics teacher didn't notice his every move. His teacher had been watching the last hexagonal lab tables as Jim took his seat there on the first day of class. The Raven had been staring at Jim since orientation day. Jim called his teacher the Raven because his long black hair reminded Jim of Edgar Allan Poe, and because a kid only knows his teachers by their family names. And Jim hated to know anybody by only their family name. The whiteness of Jim's family name above all things appalled him. The Brandeckers were the whitest family in Stickford. Farfar, Jim's grandpa, who liked Jim to call him by the Danish endearment, left the Brandeckers more than the largest tract of land in town. He told Jim that the Brandeckers had a mission to be first in the sight of all. A Brandecker had been the first to burn out the wild peach trees on his property and subdivide his apple orchard and open Pumpkin Hook, the first cemetery in town. A Brandecker had been the first to build a cider mill on Cassidy Lake because a Brandecker had been the first to convince the farmers to band together to grow apples. A Brandecker had been the first to see the value of owning the swampy Michigan lowlands along the Okemos Trail that would remind the original German settlers of their Black Forest homeland. A Brandecker had been the first Danish helmsman on the first Dutch ship to smuggle guns for the American rebels. Dad had fallen from first place with Farfar after Ma gave birth to 5 daughters before she gave Dad his first son. And Farfar never forgave Ma for baptizing Jim, the first Catholic in his otherwise Lutheran family. Farfar banished Dad for his changes to Pumpkin Hook, that Dad called big developments. Dad fired the caretaker who lived in the old mill and closed the cemetery. And on Labor Day, Dad announced his plans to demolish the old Brandecker homestead and clear space for his biggest big development, the Catholic Academy of Stickford. Ma said, "The time of fulfillment has come," and Dad said, "We've waited too long." And Farfar died at twilight on the last Saturday of September and left the whole Brandecker estate to Jim. Not even the neighbors, who knew the answers before they knew the questions, knew how come Farfar left the Brandecker property to a 14-year-old boy. Not even Jim knew how come for sure. He knew he belonged to Farfar more than any other Brandecker ever belonged to him. He stayed with Farfar for hours as a little kid. He sat in Farfar's lap in his creaky king wicker chair out on the veranda. They walked in the rain under the green buds. In the summer, Farfar would stargaze, holding Jim in his arms. They whitewashed the cemetery wall with lime, and Farfar told Jim about Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn out loud. They trimmed grass and lilacs and pulled weeds and picked wild peaches, and they raked leaves and shoveled snow off the cobblestone paths. On Halloween, Jim sorted his treats with Farfar's help. Farfar snitched Jim's favorite Snickers bars, then gave them back in bite sizes, snapped behind his back. On Christmas Eve, they sipped hot chocolate out of the same mug until Jim dozed, waiting for Santa. Sometimes they talked in words they made up, and Jim really shared the stuff Farfar had to say. He listened to his stories and his memories, and Farfar whispered the first poems Jim heard. He spoke right into Jim's ear. The words were real, made out of smoke, warm old breathing that rushed his ear in a spiral, soaked with rum, bay rum, and pipe smoke from the Virginia hills. Jim heard the neighbors on Waterloo Road. Old man Brandecker, kooky as a clock, tending his graves like his own son sick in bed. Sunrise thrilled Farfar with the higher purpose of his calling, laying the broken, the ample, the exemplary, his fellow human citizens to rest. Till morning breaks, read a familiar inscription that Farfar encouraged families to cut on the headstones of the faithful departed. Till day breaks and shadows flee. Words cut in stone are sure things, Farvar told Jim, like he told his clients. And the only thing Jim knew for sure was that now Dad needed his permission to even think about his big development. The only thing he knew from Farvar was love. The peach trees that grew wild around Stickford were the first things that Jim really saw. Small flakes of the white sky were falling. Jim put a hand on the narrow black trunk. He reached as high as he could and snapped off a brittle twig. Little green buds dotted the branch. The golden sap had frozen, and the pinchy ants had not returned. Jim had been first, like all Brandeckers. He'd been the first Brandecker to get the measles. A dark was in his room. His ghost danced on the foot of his bed. His skin felt hot and itchy. Ma put a huge cool hand on his head. Wooden logs, Lincoln logs, iron wheels as big as worlds rolled down from the ceiling with the press of her hand. How's my baby Jimmers? Dr. McKenna had huge hot hands. Measles. I'll give him an injection. Roll over on your tummy, Jimmers. The doctor's words pinched and burned. That black funeral limousine that dropped Jim off and picked Jim up from kindergarten made Jim the first kid to scare the kids at school. They said they bet Jim lived with ghosts, and they pushed him down on the playground. He always had skinned knees. The one suddenly warm spring day he walked home alone, he kept the winter coat Ma made him wear zippered up to his chin, chewing on the drawstring of his hood, and ladies gossiping on a porch watched him march past at attention with his most serious mouth, and laughed. He frowned for his first school picture, wearing chocolate corduroys with suspenders, a bow tie, and his goldenrod shirt with the yellow dragon cross-stitched on the pocket. Jim had been the first kid to get sick to his stomach the first day of first grade. Sister Dominic Michael told him to put his head down, and Jim told Sister he wanted to go home. She took him to the boys' lab. Her rosary beads rattled on the stall door while Jim stooped inside and pretended to spit up. She wiped his cheeks with cool water and patted his forehead with a stale tissue she took from the sleeve of her habit. I'll send you home. If I send you home, you'll miss our fairy tale. I'm going to tell a fairy tale about dragons. Boys are very fond of dragons, aren't they? Don't dragons, Jim said to Sister, like little boys? Sister kept a box of gold stars to stick on good foreheads and a box of black dots to mark the foreheads of bad boys. Jim got so sick in his stomach he became the first Brandecker to spend 2 weeks in the hospital. Milk allergy, Dr. McKenna diagnosed. We'll check. We don't want him to develop a calcium deficiency. We want Jim to grow up to do what boys have to do. Ma and Dad stood over his narrow bed. Jim looked desperate and frail. Jim looked puny.